Nick Fuentes began his political journey as a typical conservative teenager, heavily influenced by libertarian economic thought prevalent in the early 2010s. Growing up in a predominantly white suburb of Chicago, his initial exposure to politics was through libertarian and small government ideologies endorsed by groups like Young Americans for Liberty and conservative media outlets such as PragerU. At Boston University in 2016, amidst the polarizing atmosphere of the Trump versus Hillary Clinton election battle, Fuentes arrived as a Trump skeptic who favored more traditional libertarian figures like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. His early disdain for Trump stemmed from viewing him as a statist, emblematic of big government policies which conflicted with his libertarian values. Yet, the momentum of Trump's unexpected ascendancy and his ability to circumvent mainstream media control led Fuentes to recalibrate his stance. Realizing that traditional conservatives were ineffective in opposing the liberal media narrative, Fuentes began supporting Trump pragmatically for his winning approach, rather than ideological purity. This alignment deepened as Fuentes encountered issues like immigration, which had previously been peripheral to him. Influenced by media personalities such as Mark Levin, Fuentes' political consciousness expanded to embrace America First nationalism, catalyzed by demographic concerns and immigration's impact on the political landscape. This foundational shift set the stage for his later divergence from mainstream conservatism towards a more radical nationalist perspective. Upon arriving at Boston University, Fuentes' overt support for Trump, symbolized by his consistent wearing of the MAGA hat, subjected him to hostile reactions from the predominantly liberal student body. Peppered with verbal abuse, social ostracism, and even threats, his early college experience was marked by an intense culture clash. Notably, an incident involving an aggressive confrontation with a student wearing a hijab and others led him to file police reports, signifying the physical and psychological toll of his political expression. Fuentes quickly became a campus figure of controversy, with a small but dedicated following online, though the environment was overtly hostile towards his views. Despite opposition, Fuentes embraced public debate as a venue for legitimizing his positions. A key breakthrough came when he debated the student body president in a widely viewed event just before the 2016 election. Despite heckling, Fuentes' arguments resonated beyond the lecture hall, catching the attention of conservative media-connected individuals, including Cassie J. Dillon from the Daily Wire. This unexpected exposure marked the beginning of his entry into broader conservative media circles, but also set the stage for conflicts that would soon escalate as his views diverged from the conservative establishment. Fuentes' evolving ideology, especially his growing skepticism of Israel and neoconservatism, placed him at odds with prominent figures in conservative media such as Ben Shapiro and associates at the Daily Wire. Despite initial outreach and moderate support, Cassie J. Dillon in particular was instrumental in introducing Fuentes to this circle. Questioning the unquestionable support for Israel quickly drew fire. Shapiro's public accusations of anti-Semitism against the then-freshman Fuentes, following his critical tweets about Israeli foreign aid and politics, presaged a pattern of blacklistings and censorship. The fallout extended beyond mere professional disapproval. Fuentes describes being socially and professionally isolated by conservatives who once embraced him, culminating in demands for him to temper his rhetoric or face consequences. Persistent inquiries about Israel led to his losing friendships, the cancellation of his show on Right Side Broadcasting Network, and eventual blacklisting from the conservative media ecosystem. Attempts by defenders like Cassie Dillon to silence or delegitimize him by leveraging left-wing organizations such as Media Matters further illustrate the complexities and factionalism within conservative circles regarding dissent on foreign policy and identity topics. After his dismissal from conservative media outlets and being rejected by organizations such as the Leadership Institute due to his outspoken views on immigration and cultural identity, Fuentes embraced independent content creation. Working from his parents' basement and utilizing platforms like YouTube, he established creative control over his political messaging. Rejecting the possibility of conformity to conservative gatekeepers, Fuentes positioned himself as a vocal opponent of the establishment, standing firmly for America First nationalist ideals. This move allowed Fuentes to cultivate a dedicated, if smaller, audience that shared his frustration with what he perceived as a bankrupt conservative movement that failed to represent true nationalist and populist perspectives. His approach was to define himself as the standard bearer of authentic opposition, forcing the Republican Party and conservative media to adjust or cede influence. Fuentes' willingness to embrace political marginalization in service of his principles highlights his break from mainstream conservatism and underscores his strategic focus on cultural and demographic issues as the foundation for political renewal. Despite rhetorical alignment with the America First movement, Fuentes has been notably critical of certain prominent politicians who claim affiliation with those ideals, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, J.D. Vance, Matt Gaetz, and Joe Kent. These criticisms stem from ideological and strategic disagreements, particularly over issues of inclusiveness, the handling of race and religion, and positions on Zionism and Israel. Fuentes views phrases like inclusive populism with suspicion, interpreting them as efforts to dilute or moderate the America First message, thereby undermining its racial and cultural emphasis. His relationship with figures like Joe Kent evolved from initial support to opposition after Kent publicly distanced himself from Fuentes on grounds of Fuentes' views about Israel and Christian identity. This internal friction reveals the challenges within nationalist and populist circles to balance ideological purity, electoral pragmatism, and coalition building. Fuentes' unwillingness to soften these distinctions, even at the expense of isolating potential political allies, reflects his broader skepticism of establishment figures and his commitment to a particular vision of nationalism defined by cultural and racial identity. Fuentes described an intense and personal campaign of harassment that escalated over time, including being banned on major social media platforms, public exposure of his home address by organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, and direct threats to his safety. A stark example was an armed assassination attempt at his residence in December 2022, when an assailant who had already killed 3 people prior tried to breach Fuentes' home. This traumatic event was compounded by the apparent lack of substantive law enforcement communication or support following the incident, underscoring perceived failures in protective institutions. The attack and the months of preceding harassment, including the posting of his personal information online, constant protests, and physical intimidation, represent a literal embodiment of the volatile political climate Fuentes inhabits. These ordeals solidify his narrative of being targeted not simply for his opinions, but as a symbol of broader cultural conflict. Additionally, Fuentes attributes some of the root causes of such violence to deeper societal dysfunction involving mental health issues, substance abuse, especially SSRIs and marijuana, pornography addiction, and the isolating effects of the internet culture on young men, many of whom constitute his core audience. Fuentes expressed sharp criticism of contemporary youth culture, particularly in relation to marijuana use, internet addiction, and the prevalence of pornography. He sees these factors as deeply detrimental, fostering mental deterioration, social dislocation, and sexual dysfunction, reprogramming the male psyche toward unhealthy sexual identities and behaviors. Fuentes argues that the omnipresence and easy access to pornography disrupt real-life intimate relationships by promoting unrealistic expectations and hyperstimulation that real partners cannot match. Furthermore, Fuentes condemns the broad cultural normalization and acceptance of drug use, portraying it as a numbing escape that undermines personal responsibility and resilience. He ties these issues together as part of a broader crisis affecting young men, the demographic that forms the bulk of his support. In his view, the combination of drug use, digital echo chambers, and hypersexualized content corrodes traditional values, masculinity, and societal cohesion. Fuentes advocates for sobriety, vigilance against addictive behaviors, and a cultural return to disciplined, sober manhood as critical to personal and national revival. Central to Fuentes' worldview is a traditionalist perspective on gender roles and family structure. He critiques the feminization and liberalization of women as a primary factor in the decline of marriage and social stability. According to Fuentes, modern feminism, promiscuity, and entitlement among women have created a dynamic in which men lose authority and motivation to pursue lasting relationships. He portrays contemporary women as liberal, assertive, and high maintenance, often unwilling to fulfill traditional roles, which combined with men's perceived simping, results in widespread relationship dysfunction. Fuentes' vision insists on reasserting patriarchy with men as the leaders, decision-makers, and providers within the family unit. He situates the marital relationship as a symbiotic balance of leadership and loving service, where men love and lead, and women respect and support. This vision rejects egalitarianism in marriage and emphasizes the need for male authority for harmonious family life. He attributes much of societal decay to the abdication of male authority and women's embrace of liberal cultural norms, asserting that traditional roles lead to personal fulfillment and social order. Fuentes is profoundly pessimistic about the near future of the United States, perceiving a country on the brink of civil conflict or societal breakdown. He cites converging crises such as violent political polarization, breakdowns in law enforcement cooperation, notably between local police and federal immigration enforcement, and the rise of left-wing militias and protests. The assassination of public conservative figures like Charlie Kirk and the subsequent public celebration by liberals on social media demonstrate to Fuentes irreconcilable enmity and a cultural fracture that cannot be bridged by conventional political processes. Fuentes warns that half measures or incremental policies will only aggravate tensions and embolden radical elements on the left. He argues for a decisive government stance, including the enforcement of federal laws with the backing of military and law enforcement personnel to suppress insurrection and illegal actions. The failure to act decisively, in his view, risks escalation into all-out civil conflict, undermining the very social fabric of the nation. This sense of crisis shapes much of Fuentes' advocacy for more extreme and decisive political action. A recurring and contentious theme is Fuentes' nuanced, albeit controversial, views on Israel and its relationship to American politics. He acknowledges the historical and religious uniqueness of Jewish identity, their diaspora status, and the deep emotional and political attachment many Jews have to Israel. However, Fuentes mixes this cultural analysis with critical assessments of the pro-Israel lobby's influence over U.S. foreign policy, arguing that it represents a dual loyalty conflict that undermines American interests. He calls for transparency, restrictions on dual citizenship for policymakers, and formal registration of influential lobbying groups. Fuentes rejects anti-Semitism as hate and emphasizes individual judgment, separate from ethnic or religious identity, but insists on candid discussions of identity politics and geopolitical influence based on ethnic background. This position has isolated him from mainstream conservatives who either defend Israel unequivocally or reject ethnic explanations. Fuentes frames his views as consistent with Christian doctrine, but critically distinct from both Jewish nationalism and undue Christian Zionism, which he rejects as heretical. This complex stance is central to his broader critique of neoconservatism and foreign entanglements. An extraordinary moment in Fuentes' life was his Thanksgiving dinner with Donald Trump and Kanye West, two figures he admires deeply. This surreal encounter allowed Fuentes the rare opportunity to engage both men in conversation, witnessing West's admiration for Trump and Trump's interest and receptiveness to Fuentes' perspective. The discussion included reflections on Trump's political strategy and Fuentes' encouragement for Trump to get back his mojo by embracing a more confrontational style against internal party rivals. Fuentes' admiration for both men is rooted in their perceived embodiment of strong, unapologetic masculine leadership and cultural defiance. The dinner highlighted the varying personal dynamics and ideological nuances within the America First movement and conservative cultural spheres. Fuentes positioned himself as a loyal supporter while simultaneously urging more assertive political action. This interaction also reinforced the media significance Fuentes has amassed, symbolizing the emergence of a new generation of nationalist political influencers.